Welcome back to another episode of the Startup Therapy Podcast. This is Ryan Rutan from startups.com, joined by Will Schroeder, my friend, the founder and CEO of startups.com. Will, let's go back in time. You've just come up with your first startup idea. You found a co-founder. What's the very next thing that you plan to do?
Plan for divorce. That's the first.
Bingo! Today,
Plan for
we are
divorce.
going to talk about something really important, which is that co-founders often don't last. You may have garnered that from the title if you read it. If you're binge listening and are paying no attention to the titles, that is the title of today's episode. Co-founders often don't last, and we're going to spend some time today unpacking why that is. And what we should be doing about this as founders as we progress through this journey.
All right, so before we get into this next topic, I just want to let you know what we talk about here is like 1% of the conversation. Really this conversation is going on all day long online at groups.startups.com, where Ryan and I pretty much talk endlessly with founders about every one of these topics. So if by the end of this discussion, you like the topic and you want to dig into it a little bit more with Ryan and I, just head to groups.startups.com and we'll pick it up from there. Yeah, I think, Ryan, the problem is, just like any other relationship, when it's starting, it's always great because nothing's gone wrong yet, right? That's the problem. First date's always great. We haven't lived together yet. Nothing's gone wrong yet.
Yep.
And we don't learn who our co-founder is, our life mate, our spouse, whatever, until we go through shit with them, right?
Right.
Or we've been around long enough to know whether we want to be with them to begin with.
Yeah.
Which is why when we talk to founders and they're just putting their company together and they're saying, I've got 2 other co-founders, we're trying to figure out the equity split, that's our biggest challenge. And it's like, no, it's not. The biggest challenge right now is to have a real conversation about if shit doesn't work out, and by the way, shit usually doesn't work out, what do we plan on doing about it?
Right.
And no one has that conversation.
Nobody has it.
And yet it happens all the time. It's crazy.
But Will, we live here in Shangri-La with our unfunded pitch deck. Why would we need to plan for that?
Right.
It doesn't occur to you, and it doesn't occur to you for all the right reasons, right? You're at that really excited but vulnerable state, right? Where we're so into the idea and we're so happy that we found somebody else who likes our idea that it doesn't even occur to us to go looking for flaws,
right?
Or holes in the story, or whether this person even has applicable skills to what I'm doing, right? Like we see this a lot at places like Startup Weekend,
right?
And nothing against Startup Weekend. Amazing stuff has come out of that. It's done wonderful things for the startup community. But it's like going to a speed dating and like being forced into marrying somebody at the end of the speed round.
Right?
Not enough transpires there to be really sure that this is the person that you want to spend the rest of your startup with.
It's the last thing on our mind.
Pretty significant.
It's the last thing on our mind, right? We're like in our minds at that moment, we're thinking this person gets it. They love what I'm doing. Or maybe these couple people get it. Or they're my friends from back in the day, right?
Right.
And so co-founder must mean that equal shares of the company mean equal contribution forever. And even though we'll all have equal shares forever, we'll all contribute equally forever.
Right.
Without any thought to, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't it be the case that like if one of the people on our team has a third of the company and they're there because they're a great designer, that we may not need a designer in that capacity, a third of the company as much for the entire, like, into the end of time. So why do they have a third of the company again? Or the simple one, what if I quit? Right?
Yeah.
Why is it that we think when we form companies that all the people that we're forming them with are just going to stay on forever? Like in what world would that make sense?
Right.
And yet, every time we throw all that stuff out the window, we don't even ask the questions, the what if questions.
Right.
So today we're going to ask all the what if questions. And if you're going through this for the first time, you will be so happy that you listened to these questions. You may ignore everything we have to say. That's on you, right? Feel free. It's your prerogative.
Yeah.
That said, I guarantee, Ryan, what we'll talk about today It will come up.
Oh, 100%.
And whether we prepare
100%.
for it is going to be the $1,000,000 question.
That's the difference, right? Are you prepared for that attack and that assault and that situation or not?
Right.
And the vast majority aren't. Well, you pulled an interesting stat out on me a couple days ago, which is that most co-founders typically quit within the first year. Like if they're going to quit, it's typically within the first year.
Correct. And as you know, 62% of stats are made up. So I can't
Yes.
guarantee you that the validity of that stat is true.
I liked it though. I liked it. It was a good stat. Whether
Same
it's
with the
true or
30
not,
people assume it's
irrelevant.
true.
It proves our point, so therefore we'll leave it.
Right. Well, look, here's the thing. You've got two compounding problems. You've
Yep.
got the fact that people get into a startup, at which point they know the least about it. Right? So
Right.
we're joining a startup when it hasn't been formed yet. We haven't had to work there yet. We haven't had to work with any people. We don't even know what it does yet. Kind of a tough time to make a big commitment, right?
Yep.
The second thing is the startup itself, regardless of our commitment, also statistically has a very low probability of ever working. Hence us
Right.
not being there forever, even if we wanted to.
Exactly.
And so we've got two situations where the certainty of our longevity in the company, ours or anyone else's, is by definition totally messed up, right?
Correct.
And yet we make these binding contractual obligations to all of us, ourselves included,
Yeah.
that will be with it forever.
Right.
And then
Right.
and then we're shocked later when it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
Like, oh, come on.
and then we're mad that we have to deal with the problem that we created simply by not recognizing that there could be a problem in the future. It seems so obvious in hindsight too. That's the thing. I think it's what's so aggravating about it when it happens, is that it's like, how did I not see this coming? Right? How was I not prepared for this? Which just exacerbates the pain that you go through in that moment when you have to deal with that situation.
Right. And so let's just start from the end for a second. Very few startups prepare, in their formative stages for what might happen if and when co-founders leave.
Right.
Most of it's because they're just not thinking about that. It's kind of like when you're getting married, the last thing you're thinking about is getting divorced. Although,
Yeah.
incidentally, that's the most important time to think about getting divorced. And divorces suck, but being unprepared for these things sucks a lot more.
Yes.
Unwinding a co-founder that you made a bad decision on is so difficult later on. So giving even an ounce of thought right now is worth exponentially more later. So we'll leave that caveat kind of out there so that as you're listening to what we're talking about, you're thinking, this is going to be a really expensive thing to overlook if I have that opportunity.
Yeah, and it is. And it is. It is. And using the divorce analogy, we know how contentious those get. We
Yep.
know how nasty that can become. And just even if you're just sticking, like, let's say it's a relatively simple one. Let's just say there aren't even any children involved, right? This is just about the division of assets, right? And in a startup, those are fairly clearly delineated in most cases. Here's where it becomes problematic. People want to start to argue about, well, okay, but that's the value now. What about the future value? This thing has the potential to go on and do these other things, right? Like, that's not part of the divorce argument. So this becomes even more contentious because you're also talking about the potential, the future, or what else this could become, right? And that's the entire point, right? We're trying to grow these things. We're trying to create these huge outcomes. And so imagine what those conversations look like. Imagine how cordial people can be when they've inflated the value of this thing in their mind, and they also want to leave, but there's no provision for that. And we didn't talk about this before. And they're fully vested, which may have happened from day one. Which, by the way, don't do that. I assume we'll talk about that at some point in this episode. Will, yeah. So Will's point. Absolutely accurate. Now is the time, right? The beginning is the time.
It's your only
If
shot.
you've already begun and you haven't done it, then now is the time, right? So regardless of whether you're just getting started or you're well into this, if you haven't done it, now is the time, right? Now would be a good time to do it.
Here's the problem, though. At the beginning, we get so fired up about the idea, Ryan. Right? You come to me with your idea, I get fired up about it. I want to join. We lock arms and run into this thing, and
Yes.
we have the equivalent in almost every case of a shotgun wedding, right? We just met in Vegas, got drunk, and now we're at the cathedral at 3 a.m. getting married by Elvis, right? And at the time, it seems like a really good idea.
Yes.
But what we
I still find it weird that you made us write that into the operating agreement, but
it's got to be what it's got to be, man. Come on, it's good. And so what ends up happening though is we're making probably the largest commitment of our lives at a
Yep.
time when we know the least about the outcome, right?
Yes.
And we're making all of these assumptions, about folks that we're going to make this relationship with, and it is a relationship at every possible level. The
Sure.
interpersonal nature of it matters a lot,
Yeah.
way
Big
more
time.
than people think. And so when we get started, you and I vibe on this one thing, which is this cool idea, right?
Right.
And I want to do something new, and you want to do something new. We both love the idea, and we both want to make it happen.
Yes.
Problem is, we don't really know each other yet, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
we've and you could say, "Oh, well, we worked together on a previous job." Not the same thing,
Not
right?
the same thing.
It's again, we're going to torture this marriage analogy to death here, but it's the
It
equivalent of
works.
we've dated a bit, but we haven't lived together yet, right?
Right.
That's when things start to get real. Or you combine finances, we're married, we're kind of stuck with this thing.
Yep.
At which point, both of us have run through all of our savings and we don't know how we're going to pay our bills anymore. That's when it's not the same relationship anymore. And by the way, that happens in
Right.
almost every single startup, right? So it's not
Yeah.
an
For
anomaly,
sure.
right?
Right. No, no. It's a matter of kind of when that happens, not if.
Right. And so at that point, things start to go sideways, right? And we start to realize, man, this person's kind of a jerk, right? Or,
Yep.
hey, you were in it in good times when everybody's giving us high fives and some seed capital, but now the money's
Right.
run out. And now you're running away while the rest of us have to pick up the slack for you, right?
Yeah.
We didn't know who each other were until we had these interactions. And so we have to account for the fact that no matter who this person is, no matter how well we think we know them, we're just not really going to know them well enough. And they won't even know themselves nor ourselves until we go through this journey. And this journey is going to be painful. We don't know how people are
Right.
going to react. By the way, I just want to mention if what we're talking about today sounds like the kind of discussion you wish you were having more often, you actually can. We're online all day, every day, working through exactly these types of topics with founders just like you. So, any question you would have, or maybe some problem you just want to work through, we're here and we love this stuff. And we're easy to find. Head over to groups.startups.com and let's just start talking.
Yeah, and there's so much at stake, right? We've talked about this in a couple different ways. We did an episode about how sometimes startups outgrow people, or
Right.
sometimes people outgrow startups, right? Both of those things can happen, right? I've seen co-founders leave because they essentially couldn't keep up with the company anymore, right? Going back to, I think you said,
Yep.
there was a designer, right? Really important in the beginning, but not necessarily somebody that needs a third of the company and a third of the control over the outcome of the company. That part of it may be well settled now. To break away from the marriage analogy for a minute, think about the friends that you grew up with, and then the ones that you still hang out with, if any, and now the ones that you hang out with now, right? The startup goes through a similar evolution to a human life, right? As it grows up, what it needs and what it finds interesting and what it benefits from change entirely. Right. But the same thing can also happen with a co-founder who maybe they're a bit more advanced than the rest of the team. I've seen co-founders leave because the company wasn't moving fast enough, or because their skill set, the company wasn't at a point where they could fully be utilized.
Right.
And so they say, I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to go somewhere where I can be fully utilized, where I can use my superpowers to the fullest of their extent. Still the same problem if you didn't account for this up front, right? So it doesn't really matter why.
Right.
And there are a lot of reasons why. The outcome is still the same. If you didn't plan for this, if you don't have this, provisions within the operating agreement, have it at least having the discussion around it, it's going to be far, far worse. But as the startups change, as the people change, right? They may have been exactly the perfect person for that, 0 to 1,000 users, or for the first 12 months as you were building the business. And now they're not. And that happens, and that's okay, as long as you plan for it.
Here's the most consistent example I see time and time again. I've got the idea, and let's say it's a technology idea. It often is. Let's say it's a mobile app, right? And I want to go find a technical co-founder. And so I finally find a technical co-founder that's willing to build this thing. And so they're my co-founder. Are they my co-founder because I like this person and we've had cycles together? No. They're my co-founder because at that moment, I need someone to build my app for free. And so I make them a technical co-founder with no concept for whether or not they can exist in any capacity beyond building this MVP of an app.
Do they have leadership skills? Do they can they run a team? Can they do anything? Or are they just a good builder? Right.
Conversely, I'm going to come in from the technical co-founder side. The person I just decided to build an app with, all they had was an idea. They're actually not capable of doing anything beyond that. Beyond having the idea, they don't know marketing, they don't know fundraising, they don't know management, they don't know anything.
They had an idea.
And yet I'm tying my boat to this person? What?
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so in both cases, assuming things don't work, and they often don't work, what do I do about that? Right? And here's what I would say. What are all the assumptions I'm making right now about that person? Right?
How many days are we running this podcast?
It's gonna be a long one to go. Ryan, we should probably just focus on this for a second, right?
Yeah.
I think we talked about it in another episode, the unspoken contract that we make with someone else without talking to them about it at all.
Yep.
Right? How much time you're gonna put in, how when the going gets tough, how much you're gonna stick it out, how much personal capital you're gonna put in, how many of your connections you're gonna put in. All of those things. I assume, Ryan, my new co-founder, you are going to put all of those things into the company because I assume I am. But I'm just going to not bring that up. I'm not going to ask you.
Nope.
Going to assume.
Why would I? Right? Why would I? Because that's what needs to happen for the vision that's in my head to manifest and exist in the future. Whether that's the same vision you have or not, we won't know because we didn't talk about it, right? So you put yourself in these really dangerous situations, and these are not insignificant assumptions, right? They're not insignificant at all. And any one of those falling flat could absolutely destroy things, if not more than the relationship, right? And often that's where we see it start to break down. It's not even like, oh, you didn't make those introductions that I thought you would make, so therefore the business fails because we needed those introductions. It starts to fall apart because you didn't make those introductions, and now I'm kind of salty that you didn't make those introductions. Like, why wouldn't you do that? Like, that was the expectation that I had of you. And in the conversation that I had all by myself, of course you said yes. So why aren't you doing it now? Right? So I think that, it can begin to break down just over the relationship. And often, again, like it's a death by 1,000 cuts because we're making so many assumptions. And individually, they may not be that important, but collectively, they define the quality of that relationship. And if the quality of the relationship goes, the co-founder goes at some point, right? Like it's very rare that you see a company where you have like two warring heads that somehow still manage to maintain a company. I think I've seen it in a movie, but never in real life.
I gotta tell you, I've had this happen in a number of cases with co-founders, as part of this journey. And I'll give you an example, and I'll be specific about it. The last company I did, this company called unsubscribe.com. I had two co-founders that I had recruited. It's an idea I had for a long time. It's back before people knew how to get off of junk mail, basically. And it's a long time ago. And I was in like 4 other companies that I had built, that I was running. And I recruited 2 of my friends that I had met, which were both entrepreneurs themselves. And the 3 of us got to work in this company. Now, they made an assumption there. And it was the right assumption for them to make. They were just wrong about it. Right? They made an assumption that if it's Will's idea and he's the one bringing us in the company, he's going to be just as committed as we are. Yeah. Wrong. I was not just as committed as they were, right?
Yep.
Because I had 4 other friggin' companies that I was running, right?
Right.
Now,
your assumption was, I'm going to bring these 2 in so I don't have to do very much. I had the idea. I'm going to let them execute. It'll be great.
Here's what I thought. I think this is a really good idea, which is why I'm going to take the time and energy to make this happen, right? And if it winds up being this really, really good idea, I will quit the other stuff that I'm doing, right? Or find some other way to manage it. Right. But I had never had that conversation with them. What a mistake, right? So we get the company up and running, and we go to raise some capital, and we were very fortunate in that for this particular company, investors were jumping over themselves to invest in the company. We raised all of our Series A in like 24 hours, right? I'll be honest, never done that before, so it's not like I do that all the time. That was a first for me.
Yeah.
Um, and so the stakes are going up. Investors are coming on, some pretty big
Yep.
name investors, and the two other co-founders come to me and they say, "Hey, it's kind of game time. How in this are you?" And I'm like, well, "I'm totally in this." Like,
Yeah.
yeah, but you're running four other companies. Like, don't
Right.
bullshit us. Like, how in this actually are you? And what I liked about that is that they brought the situation to the table, right?
Yeah.
And here's what they said. They said, unless you're as 100% as we are on a go forward basis, we're going to restructure the cap table, right?
Yep.
With or without you. And it was a tough conversation, right?
Yeah.
And then that conversation lasted like 4 hours. Like, talk about a standstill, right?
Right.
And in the end, I was wrong. Okay, I just want to be very clear, right? They were right. They were willing to commit. The capital had come in with the commitment to work there, not the hey, I'll stop by to work there, right?
Yeah.
And I felt betrayed,
Yeah.
right? Because I felt like I brought this whole thing together. It was my idea, etc. But here's what's so interesting about that. Here I am with the person with the idea, kind of bringing it in, getting it started, and using some of my own resources to get it going. And even I was the one that didn't have the commitment. Okay.
Right.
This that's what I'm saying. It's not as easy as it's not obvious at all, right?
Right.
Who the person is
Right.
going to get voted off the island, right? In this
Yeah.
case, it was me,
Yeah.
and even I didn't realize it. And I do
Yeah.
this for a living.
Didn't see it
I'm going
coming.
to do a
Right? I know.
podcast about it right now. So it's not like it's obvious. It's not like we all know exactly who's going to get voted off the island.
Right.
And during that conversation, Ryan, as it's going back and forth, as time's going on, I'm angry, right? I'm angry because I feel betrayed, right? I feel like, hey, I set all this thing up, and once this thing becomes something, then they mutiny on me and try to take the company from me and all this stuff, right?
Right.
And even though in my heart of hearts I knew that this was the right move, it didn't feel right.
Right. Doesn't feel good.
But
Doesn't
guess
feel
what?
good, right.
I'm reasonable. Most people are not.
Yeah.
I have empathy and reason, right? So
Yeah.
while I'm a tough person to negotiate with at some level, you can always at least trust the fact that, I've got that bone in my body. Not
Right.
everyone does.
Nope. That's absolutely true. Yeah. And often we see, full on implosion because of that. Right.
bet.
You get two people who are unwilling, or three or four people sometimes, where it becomes a contentious thing, and somebody's getting voted off the island, and when there's no give, and there was no provision before the fact for how to deal with that, you're just stuck. You can just end in stalemate, right?
bet.
Which is the death of the startup company.
You bet.
And again, another memorable scenario for me was when there were four of us in a room, you, me included, and we were talking about our vision for startups.com and what we hoped that would become, and the amount of time we were willing to put into it, and we could all foresee riding this thing off into the future for as long as we needed to, because we were loving what we were doing so much. And then a fourth voice popped in and was like, 18 months and I'm out. That's my max on this. And the rest of us were like, what? Like, it was so utterly shocking and understandable in hindsight. Once the position was explained and why and all that, it was just so incongruous with the rest of the group. It was just it was so funny to me, but it's those situations, right? That if you're not prepared for that, if you don't have a provision for how we deal with that, that's a huge, huge issue, right? Because you're talking about fundamentally different decision making that lead to, let's do this forever and let's push this thing to a sale in 18 months, right? You got to do real different stuff to make those two things happen.
Right.
So, that I think that for me was probably the most memorable of the co-founder dissensions, like, right, these agreements where all of a sudden it's like we'd never really talked about this before. We had provisions for dealing with it, luckily, but it was like didn't see that one coming, right? Out of the blue, you just never know.
I remember that
where it's
conversation.
going to come from,
Yep.
right? Amazing,
And it's usually
Absolutely
not that
amazing.
explicit, right? In other
Right.
words, we assume that the person that we're co-founding with, or that the persons that we're co-founding with, are going to take this thing the 10 years or however long it takes to ride this out, right? Which is such a broken assumption, because none of us even knows that that's true. Again, in my case, I started the damn company and didn't realize it wasn't true, right? When I look back, I realize now that there was no way I was going to be able to hold up my end of the bargain. And so
Right.
we have to recognize on the onset that even if we have explicit conversations and everybody says, I'm all in, it just means they're in until they're not in, right? Everyone is in and committed until they're not committed, until shit
Yep.
goes wrong and they have to bounce because they can't make their mortgage, right?
Right.
Like, that's part of this game.
Yep.
And so I tell you what, we all agree that stuff can go sideways. Let's talk about how to plan for when it does.
Okay.
Right? The plan for divorce, hope for marriage. Okay.
Yes.
And there are
Well put.
very deliberate ways that we can set up a very fair structure between ourselves and our co-founders, so that if things don't work out, that we at least
Yep.
have an understood way of kind of bringing them back in alignment. Doesn't always go great. Even the
Right.
prenup doesn't always work, right?
Right.
But it at least sets an expectation for the foundation. How's that sound?
Sure. Yeah. It gives you a framework for the conversation at a bare minimum, right? And at least there's a preemptive conversation that says another conversation like this could exist in the future when things are not all roses, right? So, I mean, Mike Moyer built a business around this, right?
The slicing pie, right? Right.
Yes. So there's obviously enough of a challenge in the startup space for this that he's built an entire business and tool and methodology around it.
Okay, so
yeah,
step one, and this is the easiest one. Super easy to put in place and very easy to overlook. Everyone vests. Now, not everyone
Yes.
listening to this podcast is going to understand what vesting is, so let's just do a 60-second primer.
sure.
Vesting implies that your stock is put back into the company owns it, this kind of amorphous entity, and that you earn it back just like an employee would over a period of time. Often those periods are in the count of years. So for example, let's say that Ryan and I are splitting the company, and we say that our stock is going to vest over a 3-year period. That means each year over 3 years, we'll get a third of our equity back. If we're not around, happens all the time, if we're not around after year 1, that 2/3 of equity goes back into the company kitty, and the company can decide what to do with it. The company can decide to distribute it back to the other founders, et cetera, right?
Yep.
The point is, if I don't make it past year 1, and just to be clear, most people don't make it past year 1 in formative startups. You don't hear about them because they were ousted out of the company long before that company became a company. Almost every big company has a silent co-founder nobody's heard of. That said, we want the vesting to be in place to account for just that moment of time, that kind of trial period where everyone gets an opportunity to be there or not. And it's really clear what we do or don't have based on those milestones.
Yeah, because again, you don't know when that's going to occur, right? Investing protects you from that. If that person, if you look at the contrast, look at the antithesis to this, right? We say, all right, we're going to split the company. Here's your 50%. Here's my 50%.
Yep.
The next day I wake up and I'm like, you know what? I actually don't want to do that. But oh well, I own half the company.
Right.
I'm going to go do something else.
Good luck getting that back.
Let me know when you're going to send me the half the money, okay?
Right.
That's bad.
Right.
So with the vesting, you're protecting yourself from that, right? So if it's day 1 they decide, or day 365, or day whatever, you've got a provision for having vested them into what they were rightfully entitled to based on what you agreed upon at the beginning, right?
Little known fact, many investors from seed stage all the way up into sometimes Series A are going to require you to do it anyway.
Yes.
Often with your a large angel round or a seed round, the investors will say, guess what? Good news. All of you have to give your stock back
and you have to earn it back
Yeah.
just like an employee would over the next 3 years because they're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
If we're going to invest in this company and we're assuming you guys are getting your stake because you're going to be here, we need an insurance policy that you're actually going to be here.
Right.
And anybody that hasn't heard of this before is going to be so pissed off. They're like, what are you talking about? I own my stock. You can't take it from me and make you earn it back. Yes, you can. If you want their money on their terms, those are the terms. And it's not uncommon. And
no,
so
it's not.
Trying to achieve the same problem, though, or attack the same problem, though.
Yes.
Because there's no other way to ensure you're going to be around or have a mechanism that's so simple if you're not.
Right. I mean, put it from the investor's perspective, right? Like they've got, let's just say there's a CEO, a CMO, a CTO, a COO, right? They're investing in this company. And let's say all 4 of those folks are fully vested at this point.
Right.
And 3 days after the investment, the CMO and the CTO decide to quit.
Right.
Right. That's kind of a problem for the people who just put $2.5 million into the company, right?
Right.
Kind of an issue. So of course that needs to exist. But back to your point, right? And this isn't. I wanted a small caveat on that. This isn't just for people who fully vested from the beginning. We're not saying if you decided to fully vest from the beginning, investors could force you to adopt a vesting schedule. You may have already had a vesting schedule, and you may have fully vested. You may have put in your 2 years, your 3 years, your 5 years, whatever it was, or you may be in year 1 of 2 for vesting. You may be 50% vested, and they're going to hit the reset timer on that, right? And we see this all the time for all the reasons that we just described. May not feel good, but again, if we go back to that reasonable bone that some of us have in our body, we can understand why this needs to exist to protect the startup, to protect the investors, to make sure that things proceed as they should, and that there's provisions for what we do if they don't.
Right. Another way we can do it, and this is a little bit more complicated, but it's certainly relatively easy to construct, is we can say, Ryan, you get 40%, I get 40%. There's 20% left over in essentially an option pool.
Yep.
Each of us will earn that pro rata if we stick by these commitments. Ryan, you'll contribute a minimum of 40 hours per week. You'll commit at least $100,000 of real capital. You know, whatever we think our contributions are going to be, we just commit to them. You know what? The structure actually isn't what's important here. The important thing, what gets really interesting, is when we both make this commitment and we sign on it, and we say we will put in 40 hours or there's consequence. We will put in $100,000 or there's consequence. All of a sudden, people get a little bit more nervous and a little bit more chatty about what they really mean by that commitment. It's this incredible thing. When you ask somebody to sign on the line against anything, they actually think about it. Now, most people don't read the documents because they don't think they're important. But for this one, I guarantee people are going to pay attention to what's in that document. And that's why it's important. Allow us to sign against something, against the commitment, and say, if we don't hold up our end of the bargain, which is the same as everybody else's, there's consequence and by way of that equity.
Yeah, man. Look, so really no matter how we cut this, right, what we're trying to say is that we hope that it works out. We hope that the marriage lasts forever. We hope the startup goes on to succeed with whoever you started it with. But we also want to be really sober about having a plan for what to do if and when things go wrong, so that regardless of whether you continue with that co-founder or not, the business can move forward and go on to do all the things that you intended for it to do.
All right, so that was fun. But let's actually keep this conversation going. You've heard what we think about this, but Ryan and I would really like to hear what you think. And we're online like all day long, pretty much talking about every startup topic you could think of, from fundraising to customer acquisition to just really how to get all of this crazy startup stuff out of your head. And there's tons of other founders just like you. They're weighing in on these topics, so you'll get a chance to just hang out and meet some really smart founders. We're also super, super easy to find. You head over to groups.startups.com and let Ryan and I hear what's on your mind. Let's get to know each other a little bit, and let's just start having more of these conversations.